Hey everyone, welcome back to another episode of your Daily Guide. The new developer notes for the 7 Deadly Sins Origin are basically split into two different goals. One side is focused on fixing progression issues and cutting down on the repetitive grind that's been wearing people out, while the other side is trying to make the game feel more social and varied instead of just running the same loops every day. And honestly, a lot of these changes line up directly with complaints players have had since launch. The biggest system update is probably the engraved equipment changes, because right now, gearing can feel brutal if you end up with bad rolls. Instead of constantly crafting new gear from scratch, hoping for better quality or passives, they're adding ways to reset both the quality level and passive level on existing engraved equipment. That changes the entire flow of progression, because it means players can invest into pieces they already own, rather than throwing materials away every time RNG goes badly. It also lowers the pressure around perfect crafting, since upgrades become more recoverable instead of feeling permanent. They're also reducing the material requirements for some crafted items, especially things like remnants of the rift, which again points back to the same overall goal of reducing fatigue. A lot of players hit points where farming materials starts taking more time than the actual fun content, so lowering those requirements should smooth progression out quite a bit, especially for mid-game players trying to catch up or build multiple characters. The difficulty adjustments are another important part, because they're removing time limits from Hell and Abyss difficulties. That's a pretty significant design shift, since a lot of the frustration in those modes came from rushing rather than the mechanics themselves. Without timers, players can approach fights more steadily, focus on consistency, and actually learn encounters instead of feeling punished for not bursting bosses instantly. They're also improving the routes inside Abyss dungeons, so it sounds like they're trying to make the experience less tedious overall, instead of just making enemies weaker. At the same time, they're adding higher difficulty tiers to the Mastery Growth and Gold dungeons, which makes sense because if progression becomes easier in some areas, endgame players still need content that scales upward. So instead of only reducing difficulty across the board, they're trying to create a smoother curve, where newer or mid-level players get less friction, while advanced players still have reasons to optimize builds and teams. The second half of the notes shifts more toward gameplay variety and multiplayer systems. The new seasonal event, Echoes of Heart, seems built around story content combined with a 2-player co-op dungeon. And what's interesting is that they specifically mentioned puzzle mechanics and coordinated gameplay rather than just another damage check event. That could end up feeling a lot more engaging if the mechanics actually require communication instead of simply queuing with another person and clearing enemies faster. To support that, they're finally adding proper matchmaking for dungeon parties, along with regional chat and auto-translation features. That's honestly one of the more important quality of life updates here, because multiplayer content only works if people can actually find groups easily. Auto-translation especially matters for a game with a mixed regional player base, since it removes a lot of friction between players who normally wouldn't communicate at all. They're also introducing leaderboards for boss challenge content, which adds a competitive layer for players who care about optimization and rankings. That kind of system usually pushes build experimentation harder, because once rankings are involved, people start looking for faster clears, better rotations, and more efficient team setups, instead of just clearing content casually. One update mobile players will probably appreciate immediately is the new Combat Assist feature. From the way they described it, it's meant to simplify skill usage and character tagging during combat, which makes sense because fast combat systems can feel awkward on touch controls compared to PC. If the implementation is good, it should lower the execution barrier without completely removing player control, and that's important because mobile accessibility matters a lot in games built around constant grinding and repeated combat loops. They're also reducing elite and field boss respawn timers, which sounds small at first, but actually affects farming efficiency quite a bit. Longer respawn timers usually create downtime where players are either waiting around or competing for spawns, so shortening those timers should make material farming more consistent and less annoying overall. What stands out across all these changes is that the developers seem to be targeting pacing problems more than anything else. Most of these updates either reduce unnecessary repetition, improve accessibility, or make multiplayer interaction easier, and that's usually a good sign, because it shows they're paying attention to how players actually engage with the game day to day, rather than only adding more systems on top of existing problems.
It also reinforces why community feedback matters here, because a lot of these adjustments feel directly tied to concerns players have been raising for months. The AMAs and feedback discussions clearly aren't being ignored, so players should probably keep participating in those conversations, since the developer notes make it pretty obvious that feedback is influencing future updates. For farming specifically, it's probably worth planning ahead for these changes once they go live, because lower material requirements and faster boss respawns could completely change the most efficient routes for progression. Players who normally avoid certain grinds might find them much more manageable afterwards, especially when combined with the equipment reset systems. And even though these notes cover a lot of system-level updates, there are still details missing that will probably show up later in the actual patch notes, especially things like future characters, exact balancing numbers, or event rewards. So these developer notes feel more like the direction of the game rather than the complete picture of the update itself. But what do you think? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. If you enjoyed this breakdown and found it helpful, make sure to like and subscribe for more. Thanks for watching, take care, and I'll catch you in the next one. Peace.